India in details.
India and its Hindu ideas civilized the West, and the ancestors of those brainwashed Westerners or white Europeans who today, instead of being thankful and grateful to Hindus and Indians, visit India and make silly propaganda videos to deceitfully prove how terrible India is. Is it right to say that channels like bold and intellectually bankrupt and PewDiePie, brainwashed Western YouTubers, and supremacist or uncivilized Western propagandists are perhaps too foolish, intellectually weak, or uneducated to properly understand the West's hundreds of years old, unbroken culture of filth, slums, and dangerous beggars that hasn't ended until today? In the first episode of the series, How India Civilized the West, I explained how Hindu ideas civilized the Christian world. And yes, it is our misfortune that on YouTube there are channels like Bold and Bankrupt that have failed to properly highlight how uncivilized and poor the West actually was before it benefited from Hindu scientific ideas and looting more than $45 trillion from India, and how uncivilized the West and many Western citizens' behavior seem to be even today. So, my dear friends, don't worry. In today's episode, I will do what Bold and intellectually bankrupt could not do. But before we begin, I wholeheartedly welcome you to the second episode of this new series. And let me also tell you that more than 20 episodes of this series are on the way. And if you are from India, do not miss a single episode of this series, as it will be filled with unique and exclusive content based on undeniable facts, years of painstaking research, and hard work. So to start with, there is a lot of dirt, filth, slums, and poverty in today's England and in the Western world, no doubt about that. I will come to that later in the video. But this is not a new pattern. It is an ugly side of the long-existing Western culture that we cannot ignore. Even Europeans' trillions of dollars of colonial loot couldn't eliminate their poverty and filth. Yes, what you are seeing in these images has been an integral part of the Western world for hundreds of years. And that is why we must understand how stinky and filthy and poor European cities were before Europeans came to India to loot Bharat's massive wealth, and how unbearable and tormenting European cities were before Hindus' wisdom and Bharat's wealth contributed to civilizing the people of Europe. So please, pay attention. Take a look. Streets of London in the 1300s. People were forced to walk on streets ankle deep in a mix of wet mud, rotten fish, garbage, and animal dung. These uncivilized Europeans dumped their own buckets of feces and urine into the streets or simply sloshed it out the window. Yes, that is England before the British colonized India. And not just England, many European cities were facing similar situations. Europeans' medieval ancestors who were living around that filth caught many diseases and suffered a lot. As described here, London was filthy and dangerous. Not only that, in addition to its own poor, the city acted as a magnet for beggars, thieves and tricksters from across the country. If India should be given credit for its brilliant mathematical innovations that shaped the world, the West should be given credit for teaching the world how to innovate deceitful tricks as a beggar. Yes, my dear friends, please pay attention. 16th century England produced or came up with some of the most innovative and dangerous begging tricks. There were 5 types of beggars in England, whose descriptions are absolutely mind-blowing. English beggar, type 1. Tom or Bedlam. These type of beggars pretended to be insane and followed people around until they gave money. English beggar, type 2. The counterfeit crank. These types of beggars pretended to have violent fits and sucked on soap to froth at the mouth so that people would pity them. English beggar, type 3. The bare-top trickster. These female European beggars were dangerous. They would flash men in the street and trick them into going with them into a house. But in that house, there would be a gang of men waiting to rob them. English beggar, type 4. The clapper-dudgeon. These types of beggars would cut their skin to make it bleed and then cover it with dirt. Even some children were deliberately mutilated by their parents to get more money from passers-by. English beggar, type 5. Angler/hooker. These beggars would knock on people's doors during the day to see what can be stolen. Later, they would return after dark to steal items through windows using a hook. So yes, a mathematically enlightened scientific culture was already flourishing in India for centuries when Europe was still coming up with or discovering deceitful tricks to beg or rob. The begging infrastructure in England was so sophisticated that there were beggars who were given an official license to beg. And unlicensed beggars or vagrants who could not get that license to beg were severely punished or could be enslaved. Yes, you heard that right. The culture of slavery is deeply rooted in English society. Before becoming the champion of African slave trade, they were also enslaving their own people. And the church? Well, the church itself owned slaves or profited from them. Want to know what kind of punishments were recommended for unlicensed beggars or vagabonds? Read this. So yes, on the one hand, centuries before this, the sophisticated cities, towns and villages of India were already exporting or freely sharing their scientific ideas and innovations with the world. And on the other hand, England seems to have emerged as the hub of the most sophisticated and innovative culture of begging that you may ever come across. While many Europeans were busy begging and robbing in their stench-filled cities filled with filth, fragrance from perfumes was flowing in the streets of India. When many Europeans were walking ankle-deep in their own urine and feces on their stinky streets, the people of Bharat were shaping the history of our world, excelling in medicine, irrigation, water management, metallurgy, and more. And centuries before this, when Europe did see some normal times during the Greek and Roman period, don't forget, that also had a lot to do with Bharat. Yes, never forget that it was Bharat that was the leading trading partner of Rome and a major contributor to Rome's financial well-being. Never forget that the brutal and violent Christian takeover and rise of Christianity contributed to the fall of the Roman Empire. More on this in future episodes. Anyway, before Europe profited from wealth looted from colonies, many regions in Europe were extremely poor. For example, in England, taking birds' eggs was also deemed to be theft and could result in the death sentence. To overcome their poverty and misery, many Europeans went big. But no, I mean, a lot of them did not go big in science or scientific achievements. They went big in robbery, theft, and trafficking. With their criminal attitudes, they went global with support from their regimes. Europeans' expertise when it comes to committing crimes globally brought some unprecedented results. The golden age of piracy in Europe, the golden age of smuggling, and the golden age of the slave system in Britain. And yes, the stolen colonial loot exposed Europeans to wealth that many of them had never seen or imagined before. Besides that, colonial loot and acquiring scientific ideas from abroad contributed to the foundation of their industrial revolution. But again, it's due to Europeans' lack of intellect that, despite profiting from dirty money coming from slave trade, loot and piracy, that they failed to eliminate their poverty and filth. Yes, dirty money made many rich in the West, but poverty and slums never left the Western world. Begging, prostitution and crimes continued too. Highway robbery, riots. The list goes on and on. As far as France is concerned, it started its colonial activities to earn the dirty money, but despite earning a lot of colonial loot, France failed to eliminate its slums, filth and poverty. Yes, listen carefully, 17th century France, full of slums, full of filth, full of stench. In particular, Paris had a massive network of multiple slums, as described here, Kingdom of Beggars. But these French slums had a very interesting name. These slums were referred to as Court of Miracles. Want to know why? Well, read that here. These French slums were full of beggars who would fake various types of illnesses or health conditions to get more money. For example, fake blind beggars, fake legless beggars, etc. But after begging, when these beggars would go home in slums, they would stop pretending they were sick. They would cure themselves like a miracle. That's how the French slums got the name Court of Miracles. Yes, when it comes to innovating deceitful tricks to beg, French beggars could easily compete against the English beggars. These French slums were massive. Sex workers, dangerous criminals. These slums had them all. As described here, a monstrous city within the city. The slums even had its own leader or king who commanded all the beggars of France. Yes, you heard that right, the French king of beggars. And as expected, these French slums also had their ugly and rigid social hierarchy or a type of French caste system. Yes, they would not want to teach this side of European history in your school. That is why I'm telling you again, come forward and support our work. And by the way, the popular European practice of throwing and feces from the windows of one's house to the ground below was a way of life in France too. Even after France started its brutal colonial activities abroad, while deceitfully claiming that it was trying to civilize the people of its colonies, at home, the so-called civilized French citizens were still storing their urine and feces in a chamber pot and throwing it directly on the streets. On occasions, the contents of those pots would fall on the people walking on the filled French streets. And let us never forget that thousands of years before Europeans were behaving like this, the land of Bharat already had a sophisticated drainage and sewage system for its people. Still, some brainwashed white supremacists deceitfully claim or believe that it was Europeans that civilized India. Never forget that the French were so used to emptying their chamber pots from windows that finally, when this practice was prohibited, many so-called civilized French citizens started to store their own urine and fecal material within their homes, causing infection and stink. The so-called civilized French inhabitants were also defecating on streets and even in the well-populated halls of the Louvre. Even during the time of the French Revolution, Paris emerged as one of the foulest-smelling cities in Europe. But France didn't stop there. It also came up with some of the worst jobs in human history. For example, tanning leather using dog excrement and urine, a French product made in Paris using dog. Even after committing genocides abroad, profiting from the slave trade, looting their colonies, and earning massive dirty money, Europeans could not eliminate their filth or poverty. Not only that, many Europeans took their filth, diseases, and slums to the parts of the world they illegally occupied or colonized. For example, many from Europe came to New York and established slums, as described here. New, stinking York, filled with filth and corruption. Disease-ridden American slums where poor Europeans even cooked with clothes dye and floor cleaner to disguise the stench of rotting meat. The original American dream, or what? Take a look at these images. What has been described as new stinking York. Years went by, centuries went by, more and more loot and dirty money poured in. But despite that, slums never left the West. In 20th century London, about 30% of Londoners lived in poverty or in want. That's the map of London poverty, 1889. Many Europeans didn't just establish slums on land that they stole around the world. Europe also led from the front when it was about supplying or settling dangerous criminals and prisoners around the world. More than 30,000 British prisoners were transported to America. Shamelessly, they even earned from it as they would sell those prisoners when they got there. As America declared its independence from Britain, the British prison system couldn't cope with the resulting overcrowding. Then, Australia was chosen as an alternative colony for shipping the convicts to. As a source or supplier of dangerous criminals, Europe continued to maintain its ugly track record. Later on, Europe gifted Nazism and fascism to the world, and Nazi criminals from Germany left their homeland and settled in various parts of the world. In 2024, when you see these images of today's Europe, do not think that poverty is making a comeback here. The ugly truth is poverty and slums never left Europe. As described here, 20% of the UK population in poverty, 30% of children in the UK in poverty. And it is not just the UK. The USA, Germany, Spain, France, Portugal, the list goes on and on. That is the poverty map of 21st century France. See these images of today's France. The country that had a king of beggars and a kingdom of beggars is keeping its legacy alive very well. Hundreds of these homeless people die in just a single year, battling cold, illness, and poverty. A similar situation plays out in today's Germany. Homeless men and beggars searching for food in dustbins, slums, poverty. Take a look at this German slum. No proper water, no proper toilets, living in filth with rats. Read her story. This German woman came to Berlin to study fashion design, ended up in a slum. But Europe has a long history of persecuting its poor people, and it does it even today. Poor people's homes in slums are regularly bulldozed or destroyed. Destroying poor people's homes helps these countries maintain their fake, shiny image, especially when they host events like the Olympics. It is a similar story in today's USA. The West should learn how to treat its slum dwellers like human beings. I explained how terribly they are treated in this video several months ago. European poor were mistreated and tortured before. They are being mistreated today. Isn't it right to say that dirty money earned through loot can make you rich temporarily, but cannot remove your cultural poverty and cannot cure you? Today, in the West, from San Francisco to Europe, the centuries-old practice of defecating or urinating on streets has not stopped. Many in the West even happily swim in water that contains fecal matter. I explained that in this video. If India is giving back its $45 trillion or more that was looted by Europeans, it can regain its lost glory and rebuild its infrastructure faster. But even without that money, India is marching ahead, solving its problems and improving its condition. On the other hand, Western citizens who are beneficiaries of their loot-centric infrastructure and atrocity-driven legacy should ideally be ashamed of it and should be raising their voices against the Western colonial criminal states. But instead, they shamelessly indulge in victim-shaming the formerly colonized nations. These Western societies are filled with psychologically damaged individuals, and they need to be healed, rescued, and civilized. Remember, it was Bharat's wisdom and wealth that contributed immensely to civilizing the Western nations, and it is likely that, once again, it is Bharat's wisdom and wealth that can rescue them from their self-inflicted downfall. As far as bold and intellectually bankrupt is concerned, many Indians feel pity for him, but still, there is hope for him. This series can re-educate him. Yes, it can change the way many think about the Western India, and I encourage you to come forward and support its production by contributing financially. See you again.